Before dawn on Friday the 13th of October, in the year 1307, 20,000 armed men moved through the darkness of France like a coordinated nightmare. They had their orders, sealed instructions that could only be opened at sunrise. Every Templar fortress, every commandery, every chapter house across the entire kingdom would be hit simultaneously. The largest coordinated arrest operation in medieval history was about to begin. And when the sun rose that morning, the world would never be the same. They were called the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. But there was nothing poor about them. The Knights Templar controlled wealth that rivaled entire kingdoms. They owned thousands of properties across Europe and the Holy Land. They had invented international banking. Kings borrowed from them. Popes depended on them. They answered to no earthly authority. For nearly 2 centuries, they were untouchable, until they weren't. Until someone decided they knew too much. Until their knowledge became more dangerous than their swords. What could warrior monks possibly discover that would require their complete annihilation? What truth could be so devastating that it would justify torturing thousands of men, burning their leaders at the stake, and systematically erasing their existence from history? The official charges spoke of heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross. But those were convenient lies. The real reason lay buried beneath centuries of deliberate silence, hidden in archives that remain sealed to this day, protected by the same institution that orchestrated their destruction 700 years ago. Because the Templars spent 9 years excavating beneath the ruins of Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, 9 years digging through ancient tunnels that predated Christianity itself. They weren't there to pray. They weren't there to guard pilgrims. They were searching for something specific, something that the Church Fathers knew existed, but could never allow to surface. And when they found it, when they brought that knowledge back to Europe, they became the most dangerous organization in Christendom. Not because of what they could do with swords, but because of what they could do with truth. On the night before the arrests, 18 Templar galleys vanished from La Rochelle harbor. The entire fleet, loaded with treasure, manuscripts, and the last knights who knew where the real secrets were hidden. The king's men searched every port, every coastline, every river. They found nothing. Those ships disappeared as completely as if they had sailed off the edge of the world. But they didn't vanish. They simply went somewhere no one was looking. Somewhere the truth could survive. And 7 centuries later, the evidence of their journey still exists, scattered across continents, buried in archives, carved into stone, waiting for someone willing to see what the Vatican has spent 700 years trying to hide. Imagine you are a Templar knight, sleeping in your commandery on the night of Thursday, October 12th, 1307. You have spent the day in prayer and training, as you have done for the past 15 years of your life. You are a warrior monk, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. You have fought in the Holy Land. You have witnessed miracles and horrors that would break ordinary men. You believe yourself to be untouchable, protected by God and the Pope himself. You have no idea that in less than 6 hours, everything you know will collapse. You have no idea that you are sleeping through your last night of freedom. Across France, 20,000 royal soldiers are receiving sealed orders. They cannot open them until dawn. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, has orchestrated something unprecedented. A coordinated military operation that will strike every single Templar property in his kingdom simultaneously. Every fortress, every church, every farm, every banking house. The logistics alone are staggering. In an age without telecommunications, without rapid transport, without modern coordination, he has managed to synchronize an arrest operation that spans an entire nation. The orders are identical. Arrest every Templar, seize every asset, allow no one to escape. This is not a police action. This is a military conquest disguised as law enforcement. But here is what makes this night truly terrifying. The Templars have no warning, none, Despite their legendary intelligence network that spans from Scotland to Jerusalem, despite their connections to every court in Europe, despite their wealth and influence, they sleep peacefully. How is this possible? How does an organization with spies in every kingdom, with agents in every port, with informants in every major city, fail to detect an operation of this magnitude? The answer is simple and chilling. Someone betrayed them. Someone at the highest level of their order. Someone who knew their security protocols. Someone who could ensure that the right people would be in the right places at the wrong time. The sun rises at 6:23 in the morning on Friday, October 13th. In Paris, in Lyon, in Toulouse, in Marseille, in every city and town across France, soldiers break down doors. They are not gentle. They are not respectful. These are Templars, after all. Men who have killed Saracens by the hundreds. Men trained in combat since childhood. Men who, if given even a moment to organize, could turn any confrontation into a bloodbath. So the soldiers move with overwhelming force. 10 men for every Templar. 20 if the knight is known to be particularly skilled. They burst into bedrooms. They drag monks from chapel. They chain men who are still half asleep, still confused, still trying to understand what is happening. In the Paris Temple, the largest Templar fortress in France, Jacques de Molay wakes to the sound of armored boots on stone. He is the Grand Master of the entire order, the most powerful Templar alive, a man who has dined with kings, negotiated with sultans, commanded armies in the defense of Christendom. He reaches for his sword. It is not there. Of course it is not there. He sleeps in the heart of Christian Europe, in a fortress that has never been breached, protected by 100 knights who would die for him. Or so he thought. The door to his chamber explodes inward. 6 soldiers rush in. They are not there to negotiate. They are not there to explain. They grab him. They chain him. And Jacques de Molay, 72nd Grand Master of the Knights Templar, is dragged from his bed like a common criminal. Across France, the scene repeats with mechanical precision. In Poitiers, 50 knights are arrested during morning prayer. In Beaucaire, they catch the Templars at breakfast. In Cahors, soldiers arrive just as the knights are arming themselves for the day, but before they can organize any resistance. The timing is perfect. Too perfect. This level of coordination suggests months of planning. It suggests detailed intelligence on the daily routines of every Templar house. It suggests that someone has been watching them, studying them, documenting their every movement for a very long time. You start to realize that this is not a spontaneous action. This has been prepared with the care and attention usually reserved for military campaigns against foreign enemies. By noon, it is over. Over 5,000 Templars are in chains. Knights, sergeants, priests, administrators, even the stable boys and cooks who served in Templar households. Everyone associated with the order is arrested. Their properties are sealed. Their bank accounts are frozen. Their records are confiscated. In a single morning, one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe has been decapitated. But here is what troubles the historians who study this day. The operation is too clean, too efficient. Medieval arrests were usually chaotic affairs. There would be escapes, resistance, confusion. But on this day, almost no one gets away. Out of thousands of arrests across an entire kingdom, fewer than 20 Templars managed to evade capture. How? The answer lies in what was taken from them the night before. Because something impossible happened on the night of October 12th. The Templar fleet vanished. 18 galleys disappeared from La Rochelle harbor. These were not small boats. These were war galleys, capable of carrying 100 men each. They required crews of 50 to 70 rowers. They needed provisions, water, cargo. You cannot hide 18 ships. You cannot move them without being seen. La Rochelle was a busy port. There were customs officials, harbor masters, merchants, sailors from a dozen nations. Yet somehow, between sunset on October 12th and sunrise on October 13th, the entire Templar fleet sailed away and no one reported seeing anything. No one raised an alarm. No one thought it strange that the largest naval force in the port simply disappeared into the night. This is where the official narrative begins to crack. King Philip would later claim that he arrested the Templars to stop their heretical practices. But if that were true, why did he wait until after their fleet escaped? If you want to destroy an organization, you do not let its navy sail away with its treasure. Unless the treasure was not the point. Unless what he really wanted was something else. Something that was not on those ships. Something that had to be extracted through pain and fear and torture. Something that existed only in the minds of the captured knights. Knowledge, secrets, truths that could not be allowed to survive. In the days following the arrests, the prisoners are distributed among various royal prisons and church dungeons throughout France. They are not tried. They are not charged with specific crimes. They are simply held. And then quietly, the questioning begins. Not public trials, not formal interrogations, private sessions, behind closed doors, with instruments of persuasion that medieval law technically forbids, but everyone understands, are necessary when dealing with enemies of the faith. The Templars are told that they will be asked questions. They are told that their answers will determine their fate. They are not told that their screams will echo through history for 700 years. What happens in those dungeons will become the foundation of one of the great mysteries of the medieval world. Because under torture, the Templars begin to confess. They confess to things that sound insane. They confess to spitting on the cross, to denying Christ, to worshiping a mysterious head called Baphomet, to obscene rituals conducted in secret, to heretical beliefs that would make them enemies of God and man. The confessions are recorded in detail. They are notarized. They are witnessed by priests and royal officials. They become the legal justification for everything that follows. But here is what the inquisitors do not realize. Here is what gets lost in the transcripts. Between the confessions of impossible heresies, between the screams and the begging, the Templars are saying something else. They are speaking about something they found, something they discovered beneath the temple in Jerusalem, something that changed them, something that made them dangerous, not because of what they did, but because of what they knew. And that knowledge, that terrible truth, is what the Vatican has been hiding for 7 centuries. That knowledge is why every single document related to the Templar arrests remains classified in the deepest levels of the Vatican archives. That knowledge is why, 700 years later, the Church still refuses to fully admit what really happened on Friday the 13th of October, 1307. In the year 1118, 9 French knights arrived in Jerusalem. They came with nothing, no army, no wealth, no obvious qualifications, just 9 men claiming they wanted to protect Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads leading to the Holy City. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem welcomed them. He gave them something extraordinary. He gave them permission to establish their headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built directly on top of the ruins of Solomon's Temple, the holiest site in Judaism. the place where the Ark of the Covenant once rested, the spot where heaven and earth were said to meet. And these 9 unknown knights moved in and began digging. For 9 years, they did almost nothing else. 9 years of excavation beneath one of the most sacred sites in the world. Think about that timeline. 9 years. In medieval terms, that is an eternity. Knights were supposed to be out fighting, protecting pilgrims, engaging in the Crusades, but these 9 men stayed underground. They brought in no reinforcements. They recruited no new members. They protected no pilgrims. Historical records from this period are strangely silent about their activities. Chroniclers who documented every minor skirmish, every political intrigue, every religious ceremony somehow failed to mention what the founding Templars were actually doing. This silence is not accidental. This silence was purchased. Someone wanted to make sure that no one paid attention to what was happening beneath the Temple Mount. Who were these 9 men? Their leader was Hugues de Payens, a minor nobleman from Champagne. With him were Godfrey de Saint-Omer, André de Montbard, Payen de Montdidier, Archambault de Saint-Agnan, Gondomar, Rossal, Godefroy Bissol, and one other whose name has been deliberately erased from every record. 8 names survive. 1 does not. Why? What could the 9th knight have known or represented that required his complete removal from history? Some historians suggest he was the true leader. Others propose he was the one who knew exactly what they were looking for. A few believe he was the one who found it. His erasure suggests that his very existence was too dangerous to acknowledge. What were they digging for? The official story says they were simply establishing their headquarters, doing routine construction and maintenance. But you do not spend 9 years doing routine construction. You do not dedicate nearly a decade of your life to digging unless you are searching for something specific, something valuable, something worth the investment of time, secrecy, and resources. The truth is that these knights had information, maps, documents, knowledge passed down through channels that the Church would never acknowledge. They knew something was buried beneath Solomon's temple, something that predated Christianity, something that could rewrite everything the Church had spent 1,000 years constructing. Archaeological evidence discovered in the 19th century confirms what historians long suspected. British archaeologist Charles Warren explored the tunnels beneath the Temple Mount in 1867. He found evidence of medieval excavation, Templar crosses carved into walls deep underground, tools and artifacts that could be dated to the 12th century, tunnels that led to chambers that had been deliberately sealed and then reopened. The Templars were not doing construction. They were conducting a systematic archaeological dig. They were following a plan. They knew where to dig. They knew what they were looking for, and the evidence suggests they found it. But what was it? What could possibly be so important that it would justify 9 years of secret excavation? The theories range from the obvious to the impossible. Some say they found the Ark of the Covenant, hidden by Jewish priests before the Babylonian destruction of the First Temple. Others claim they discovered the treasure of the Second Temple, gold and sacred objects worth an incalculable fortune. A few researchers propose they found ancient texts, scrolls that predated the Gospels, documents that told a very different story about the origins of Christianity. The most controversial theory suggests they found proof of something that would destroy the very foundation of Christian authority. Proof that Jesus was not divine, proof that he had children, proof that the bloodline continued. Here is what we know happened next. In 1127, after 9 years of digging, the founding knights suddenly left Jerusalem. They returned to Europe, and within months, everything changed. Pope Honorius II gave them official recognition. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential Christian thinker of the age, wrote their rule and became their most passionate advocate. Kings and nobles began donating vast estates to the order. Within a decade, they went from 9 unknown knights to thousands of members across Europe. This is not normal. This is not how medieval organizations grew. Something happened. Something convinced the most powerful men in Europe that the Templars needed to be supported. Something gave these knights leverage over popes and kings. Bernard of Clairvaux is particularly interesting. Before the Templars returned from Jerusalem, he was already famous for his theological writings. He was a reformer, a mystic, a man who claimed to have visions of the Virgin Mary. But after the Templars came back, his writings changed. He began emphasizing certain themes that had not been central to his earlier work. He wrote extensively about the importance of sacred architecture, about hidden knowledge, about the secrets that could only be revealed to the worthy. He became obsessed with geometry, with sacred proportions, with the idea that certain truths could be encoded in stone. Why? What did the Templars show him? What did they tell him that transformed his entire theological framework? The wealth that poured into the Templar order after 1127 was staggering. Within 20 years, they owned properties across France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the Holy Land. They built castles and churches using architectural techniques that seemed to appear from nowhere. Gothic architecture, with its impossible soaring arches and geometric precision, emerged almost simultaneously with Templar expansion. Coincidence? Or did they bring back knowledge of ancient building techniques? Knowledge that came from texts discovered beneath the temple. The great Gothic cathedrals of Europe are filled with symbols that predate Christianity. Solar calendars, astronomical alignments, mathematical ratios found in Egyptian and Greek temples. How did medieval stonemasons suddenly possess this knowledge? But the real power of the Templars was not architectural. It was financial and political. Within 50 years of their return from Jerusalem, they had created the first international banking system. They invented the concept of credit. They issued letters of exchange that could be cashed at any Templar house in Europe. They became the bankers to kings. When Philip II of France needed money for his crusade, he borrowed from the Templars. When Henry III of England needed funds for his wars, the Templars provided them. They were not just wealthy, they were essential. They controlled the flow of money across Christendom. And that kind of power does not come from luck or clever business practices. That kind of power comes from having something that others desperately need, something that makes you untouchable. What could give a religious order such leverage over secular rulers? Think about it. Kings and popes allowed the Templars to operate outside normal laws. They paid no taxes. They answered to no authority except the Pope himself. They could maintain armed forces in times of peace. They could conduct financial transactions that would be illegal for anyone else. This is not the kind of privilege you grant to an organization out of gratitude or religious devotion. This is the kind of privilege you grant to an organization that has something on you, something you cannot afford to have revealed. The Templars discovered something beneath Solomon's temple that gave them power not through military might, but through knowledge, through secrets, through the ability to destroy reputations, delegitimize rulers, and undermine the very foundations of religious authority. And that is why, Nearly 200 years later, King Philip IV of France had to destroy them. Not because of what they owned, not because of their wealth or their military power, but because of what they knew. Because somewhere in their archives, in their secret libraries, in the memories of their highest-ranking members, there existed information that could not be allowed to survive. Information that threatened not just the Church, but the entire social order of medieval Europe. Information that, if revealed, would prove that everything people believed about Christianity, about divine authority, about the legitimacy of kings and popes, was built on a foundation of lies. That is what was buried beneath Solomon's temple. That is what the Templars found. And that is what the Vatican has spent 700 years making sure you never discover. Beneath Vatican City lies 53 miles of shelving. 53 miles of documents, manuscripts, letters, and testimonies spanning 2,000 years of Christian history. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, supposedly to make them sound less ominous. But changing the name does not change what is stored there. It does not change the fact that entire sections remain classified at levels beyond top secret. It does not change the reality that certain documents can only be accessed with direct papal permission, and even then, only under the strictest supervision. The Templar archives are buried in the deepest section, and there is a reason they have never been fully released. The official records of the Templar trials fill hundreds of volumes, transcripts of interrogations, confessions extracted under torture, witness testimonies, financial records of seized properties, lists of arrested knights and their fates. These documents have been partially available to scholars since the 19th century, but they represent only a fraction of what actually exists. For every page that has been released, historians estimate that 10 to 20 pages remain sealed. Why? What could possibly justify keeping 700-year-old trial records classified? The answer lies not in what the Templars were accused of doing, but in what they confessed to knowing. Between the screams, between the confessions of impossible heresies, they spoke about something else, something the Church could never allow to become public. The torture began in earnest in November of 1307, 1 month after the mass arrests. The inquisitors were not interested in quick confessions. They wanted details. They wanted names. They wanted locations. Most importantly, they wanted to know where the Templar secrets were hidden. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was tortured repeatedly over a period of months. The techniques were brutal even by medieval standards. The strappado, where the victim is hung by the wrists tied behind the back, dislocating both shoulders. The rack, stretching the body until joints separate. Burning irons applied to the soles of the feet. Sleep deprivation for days at a time. Starvation combined with the constant threat of worse torture to come. Men broke. Of course they broke. The human body has limits. The human mind has breaking points. But here is what the inquisitors did not expect. When the Templars broke, when they finally started talking, they did not just confess to the charges. They confessed to something far more dangerous. They spoke about documents, ancient texts discovered beneath the temple, manuscripts that told a different version of Christian history, letters written by figures who were supposed to be illiterate, genealogies that traced bloodlines back to Jesus himself. And they spoke about a discovery so fundamental, so threatening to church authority, that the mere knowledge of its existence justified their destruction. The confessions were recorded. Every word was written down, and then those specific sections were classified. removed from the public records, buried so deep that most historians do not even know they exist. In 1312, Pope Clement V commissioned a papal investigation into the Templar charges. This investigation, separate from the royal trials in France, was supposed to be more objective, more fair. The result was a document called the Chignon Parchment. It recorded the testimony of Templar leaders, including Jacques de Molay, before papal officials. For 700 years, this document was thought to be lost. Then in 2001, researcher Barbara Frail found it buried in the Vatican Archives. It had been misfiled, deliberately or accidentally, in a section unrelated to the Templars. What she discovered changed everything historians thought they knew about the trial. The Pope had actually absolved the Templars of heresy. He had found them innocent of the charges. But this absolution was never made public. It was hidden. Why would the Pope absolve them in secret, but allow their persecution to continue? The answer lies in what else is written in that document. The published version that scholars can access is heavily redacted. Entire sections are blacked out. Paragraphs are missing. The most crucial testimony, the parts where the Templars spoke about what they actually discovered in Jerusalem, has been removed. Even Barbara Frail, who discovered the document, has stated in interviews that she was not allowed to see everything. That certain pages were shown to her briefly and then removed. That Vatican archivists stood over her shoulder, dictating which parts she could photograph and which she could not. This is not standard academic practice. This is not how historical research works. This is active suppression of information 7 centuries after the fact. But some fragments have leaked over the years. Whispers from archivists who saw too much. Deathbed confessions from priests who worked in the classified sections. Copies of documents that were never supposed to leave Vatican City. These fragments tell a consistent story. The Templars discovered genealogical records beneath Solomon's temple. Documents that proved Jesus had married, that he had children, that his bloodline continued through a line of descendants who fled to France after the crucifixion. This would be devastating enough. It would undermine the doctrine of Jesus' divinity, the concept of his unique sacrifice, the entire theological foundation of Christianity. But the documents apparently went further. They suggested that the early church knew about this bloodline, that the suppression of this truth was deliberate, that the entire structure of papal authority was built on a lie. Imagine you are a medieval inquisitor reading these confessions. Imagine you are a cardinal in the Vatican Archives, holding documents that prove your entire faith, your entire career, your entire understanding of reality is based on a deliberate falsification. What do? You cannot release this information. You cannot acknowledge it. But you also cannot destroy it, because destroying it would be an admission that it existed. So you hide it. You classify it at the highest possible level. You create security protocols that ensure only the most trusted individuals ever see it. And you pray that it stays buried forever. This is not conspiracy theory. This is standard practice for information that threatens institutional survival. The torture confessions reveal another troubling pattern. Multiple Templars, interrogated separately in different locations, described the same artifacts. They spoke about a cylindrical container, approximately 1 meter long, made of wood and metal. They described scrolls inside this container, written in ancient Hebrew and Greek. They mentioned specific names: James, Simon, Judas. These were not the apostles. These were described as the brothers of Jesus, family members who wrote accounts of his life that contradicted the canonical Gospels. several Templars mentioned a document they called the Testament of the Magdalene, a first-person account allegedly written by Mary Magdalene describing her relationship with Jesus. Not as a follower, not as a disciple, as his wife. The inquisitors documented all of this. They recorded every detail. And then they made sure none of it would ever be taught in any church, any university, any history book. Some researchers have pointed out linguistic anomalies in the trial records. Certain Latin phrases appear repeatedly in testimonies from Templars who were interrogated hundreds of miles apart. These phrases do not sound like translations from French or regional dialects. They sound like the Templars are quoting from memorized texts, as if they had been trained to recite specific information if captured, as if the order had prepared them for exactly this scenario. The phrases include references to hidden knowledge, to bloodlines, to sacred geometry, to truths that transcend earthly authority. These are not the confessions of terrified men making up stories to stop the pain. These are structured, consistent accounts of actual beliefs, actual knowledge, actual secrets that the order preserved and protected. In 1314, after 7 years of torture, trial, and imprisonment, Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake in Paris. He was 70 years old. As the flames rose around him, witnesses reported that he recanted his confession, that he proclaimed the innocence of the Templars, that he called on God and the Pope to answer for their crimes within a year. Pope Clement V died 33 days later. King Philip IV died in a hunting accident 8 months after that. Both deaths were sudden. Both were unexpected. Medieval chroniclers saw divine judgment. Modern historians see coincidence. But what is rarely discussed is what Jacques de Molay said in the moments before he died. Several witnesses claimed he spoke about hidden archives, about documents that would outlast the flames, about truth that could not be burned. His exact words were never officially recorded, but the message was clear. The secrets did not die with him. Today, 700 years later, the Vatican continues to maintain extraordinary security around the Templar archives. Researchers who wish to access even the publicly available documents must apply months in advance. They must provide detailed justifications for their research. They must agree to strict limitations on what they can photograph, copy, or publish. And there are sections they cannot access at all. Entire collections marked with security classifications that officially do not exist. Historians know these collections are there. They can see the gaps in the catalog. They can identify the missing sequence numbers, but they cannot view the contents. When they ask why, they are told the documents are too fragile, too damaged, too sensitive, too dangerous. After 7 centuries, the truth is still considered too dangerous to reveal. On the night of October 12, 1307, 18 Templar galleys sat anchored in La Rochelle harbor. These were not merchant vessels. These were military warships, each capable of carrying 100 fully armed knights plus crew. They represented the entire naval power of the Templar Order in the Atlantic. Harbor records from that evening note their presence. Customs officials documented their cargo manifests. Local merchants reported seeing activity around the ships. And then, sometime between midnight and dawn, they vanished. When King Philip's soldiers arrived at the harbor the next morning to seize the fleet, they found empty berths. No ships, no crew, no trace of where they had gone. It was as if 18 massive warships had simply ceased to exist. How do you hide 18 ships? This is not a matter of sailing away quietly. These were galleys requiring crews of 50 to 70 men each to row. That means somewhere between 900 and 1,200 men were involved in this escape. They would have needed provisions for a long voyage. Water barrels, food supplies, weapons, the documents and treasures they were protecting. Loading this amount of cargo onto 18 ships would take hours, even with experienced crews working efficiently. Yet no one in La Rochelle reported seeing anything unusual that night. No dock workers mentioned being hired to load cargo. No tavern keepers remembered serving large groups of sailors preparing for departure. The silence is absolute. And that silence suggests something darker than a simple escape. It suggests coordination. It suggests that someone in La Rochelle was paid to forget, that witnesses were bought, that records were destroyed. Where did they go? For 700 years, historians have debated this question. The official position of the Church and most academic institutions is that the ships were probably scuttled at sea or sailed to remote ports where they were abandoned. This explanation is convenient. It is tidy. It requires no further investigation, but it is almost certainly false, because evidence of Templar presence after 1307 appears in locations that make no sense if the order was truly destroyed. Evidence that suggests the fleet did not simply disappear. Evidence that proves they had a destination, a plan. A new world where they could continue their mission away from the reach of European kings and popes. The first confirmed sighting came from Scotland. In 1314, 7 years after the arrests, a Templar fleet appeared off the coast of Argyll. They fought alongside Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn, helping Scotland win independence from England. This is documented in Scottish records. The arrival of mysterious knights bearing the white mantles with red crosses is described by multiple chroniclers. These were not Scottish knights. They spoke French. They used cavalry tactics that were distinctly Templar. And after the battle, Robert the Bruce granted them lands and protection. He established the Royal Order of Scotland, a knightly organization that welcomed former Templars. Scotland became a refuge, became a place where the order could survive under a different name. But Scotland could not have been the only destination. 18 ships did not sail to Scotland. Some of them went somewhere else. Portugal provides another piece of the puzzle. Unlike France and most of Europe, Portugal did not arrest its Templars. King Dinis I refused to implement the papal order for their suppression. Instead, he negotiated with Pope John XXII to create a new order. In 1319, the Order of Christ was established. It had the same structure as the Templars, the same rules, the same hierarchy. Many of its founding members were former Templars who simply changed their name. The Order of Christ inherited all Templar properties in Portugal, and 70 years later, this order would fund the Portuguese Age of Exploration. Henry the Navigator, who launched the expeditions that discovered the route to India, was the Grand Master of the Order of Christ. The ships that explored the African coast and eventually reached the Americas sailed under the Templar cross. Not the red cross on white, the modified version. But the symbolism was unmistakable. Now we come to the controversial evidence. In 1998, archaeologist Jacques de Mailleux published research on stone carvings found in the Paraná region of Argentina. The carvings depicted ships with distinctive designs, knights in armor, crosses that matched Templar iconography. The dating techniques placed these carvings in the 14th century, 300 years before Columbus. The academic establishment immediately rejected his findings. They called him a fraud. They questioned his methodology. But de Mailleux was not alone. Other researchers have found similar evidence in Brazil, in Mexico, in Nova Scotia. stone structures that use architectural techniques identical to Templar constructions in Europe. Symbols carved into rock faces that match Templar insignia. Oral traditions among indigenous peoples describing pale-skinned warriors who arrived in great ships long before the Spanish conquistadors. The Oak Island mystery in Nova Scotia presents perhaps the most compelling physical evidence. In 1795, a teenager named Daniel McGuinness discovered a depression in the ground on Oak Island. He began digging and found a shaft that went down over 100 feet. The shaft was engineered with platforms every 10 feet, with flood tunnels designed to prevent excavation, with a level of sophistication that should not have existed in 18th century Nova Scotia. Over 200 years of excavation have revealed artifacts including medieval coins, a piece of parchment, and structural elements that match construction techniques used by Templars. Carbon dating places the construction of the shaft in the 14th century. Someone buried something on Oak Island around the time the Templar fleet disappeared. Someone with engineering knowledge and resources that match exactly what the Templars possessed. But the most intriguing evidence comes from maps. In 1513, Turkish Admiral Piri Reis created a world map that showed the coastline of Antarctica. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. How could a 16th century map show a continent that would not be seen by European eyes for another 300 years? Piri Reis claimed his map was based on older charts that dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, charts that were reportedly kept in the Library of Alexandria, charts that might have been among the documents discovered by Templars beneath Solomon's Temple. The Piri Reis map shows South America with remarkable accuracy. It shows the Caribbean islands. It shows geographical features that match reality, but were supposedly unknown to medieval Europeans. If the Templars had access to ancient maps, if they knew about lands across the Atlantic, then sailing there in 1307 would not have been an act of desperate exploration. It would have been following a known route. Consider the logistics. 18 galleys with full crews and passengers could carry approximately 2,000 people. 2,000 Templars and their servants, their families, their associates. This is not a small group. This is a population capable of establishing colonies, capable of building settlements, capable of surviving in hostile environments using medieval technology. And they would have brought skills, engineering, agriculture, military training, literacy in an age when most people could not read, knowledge of metallurgy, architecture, navigation. If this group reached the Americas in the 14th century, they would have had a 300-year head start on European colonization. 3 centuries to establish themselves, to integrate with local populations, to hide their origins, to wait. The indigenous oral histories of certain North American tribes describe something impossible. They tell of white-bearded men who came from the east in great boats, men who taught them new agricultural techniques, men who built stone structures, men who wore crosses and spoke of a god who was not their own. These stories predate Columbus by centuries. Anthropologists have documented them, and while most dismiss them as myth or fabrication, the consistency across different tribes, different regions, different linguistic groups is striking. These stories describe men who did not come to conquer, men who came seeking refuge, men who were running from something. This matches the Templar profile perfectly. And then there is the matter of the Templar treasure. The order was fabulously wealthy. Their treasuries in Paris, London, and other major cities contained gold, silver, jewels, and relics worth kingdoms. All of this was seized when the arrests began. But the inventories do not match what the Templars were known to possess. Vast amounts of treasure are unaccounted for. Where did it go? The obvious answer is that it was loaded onto those 18 ships, that it sailed with the fleet, that it was used to fund whatever came next. Treasure can buy silence. It can buy cooperation. It can purchase land, supplies, and loyalty. If the Templars reached the Americas with their wealth intact, they would have had the resources to establish a permanent presence, a hidden kingdom, a secret empire waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, or perhaps waiting forever, perhaps understanding that some secrets are too dangerous to ever expose, that some truths must remain buried even as the world changes around them. The official story says the Knights Templar were destroyed, arrested in 1307, tortured, tried, executed, their properties confiscated, their order dissolved by papal decree in 1312. History books teach that the most powerful military and financial organization of the medieval world simply ceased to exist. But organizations do not die. They transform, they adapt. They change names, symbols, and structures while preserving their core purpose. The Templars understood this. They had 9 years of warning between their return from Jerusalem and the systematic campaign to destroy them. 9 years to prepare. 9 years to create contingencies. 9 years to build alternative structures that could survive even if the order itself was officially annihilated. Look at what happened in Portugal. While France burned Templars at the stake, Portugal welcomed them. King Dinis I openly defied the papal order to suppress the order. He negotiated directly with the Pope to create a new organization that was, in every meaningful way, the Templars under a different name. The Order of Christ was established in 1319, just 7 years after the official dissolution. It inherited all Templar properties in Portugal. It used the same organizational structure. It followed the same rules. Its members wore white mantles with a modified version of the Templar cross. The only difference was the name, and this was not done in secret. This was an official, church-sanctioned transformation. The Pope knew exactly what was happening. He approved it. Because the alternative was worse. The alternative was having thousands of trained knights with knowledge of secrets that could destroy the church, operating completely outside of any control. The Order of Christ did something remarkable. It funded the Age of Exploration. Henry the Navigator, who launched Portugal's maritime expansion in the 15th century, was the Grand Master of the Order of Christ. The ships that explored the African coast flew the Order's flag. The expeditions that eventually reached India and the Americas were financed with Order resources. Vasco da Gama, who discovered the sea route to India, was a member of the Order of Christ. His ships bore the distinctive cross. When the Portuguese reached the Americas, when they established colonies in Brazil and beyond, they were continuing a Templar mission. Not a religious mission, a mission of knowledge, a mission to find something, or perhaps to reach something they already knew was there. Remember those 18 ships that vanished from La Rochelle? Remember the evidence of pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas? The Order of Christ had access to Templar maps, Templar knowledge, Templar secrets about what lay across the Atlantic. In Scotland, the transformation was equally deliberate, but more hidden. Robert the Bruce welcomed Templars after Bannockburn. He created the Royal Order of Scotland as a refuge for knights fleeing persecution. But something else emerged from this protection: Freemasonry. The connection between Templars and Freemasons has been debated for centuries. Mainstream historians dismiss it as romantic fiction, but the evidence is difficult to ignore. Freemasonry emerged in Scotland in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, exactly when and where Templar refugees would have needed to create new organizational structures. The rituals are remarkably similar. The symbolism overlaps. The emphasis on sacred geometry, on hidden knowledge, on levels of initiation that reveal progressively deeper secrets, these are all Templar characteristics. And the highest degrees of Scottish Rite Freemasonry explicitly reference Templar origins. The 30th degree is called Knight Kadosh, dedicated to avenging Jacques de Molay. The highest degree, the 33rd, involves secrets that are never written down, only transmitted orally. Secrets about what the Templars really discovered, secrets about bloodlines and hidden truths. Freemasonry spread across Europe through networks that mirror exactly where Templar influence had been strongest: France, England, Germany, Italy. By the 18th century, Freemasonry had become the most influential secret society in the world. Its members included kings, scientists, philosophers, revolutionaries. George Washington was a Freemason. Benjamin Franklin was a Freemason. Many of the men who founded the United States were Freemasons. They built Washington using sacred geometry. They encoded symbols into the architecture of government buildings. The street layout of the Capitol forms pentagrams and other geometric patterns that would be familiar to anyone who studied Templar constructions. The Great Seal of the United States contains imagery that directly references hidden knowledge and enlightenment. All-seeing eyes, pyramids, Latin phrases about new orders for the ages. This is not coincidence. This is deliberate continuation of a tradition that traces back to Solomon's Temple. But Freemasonry was not the only transformation. The Rosicrucians emerged in the early 17th century, claiming to possess ancient wisdom about the of reality. Their founding documents speak of Christian Rosenkreuz, a mythical figure who supposedly discovered secret knowledge in the Middle East. The parallels to the Templar story are obvious. A Christian knight travels to the Holy Land. He discovers hidden wisdom. He returns to Europe to establish a secret brotherhood dedicated to preserving this knowledge. The Rosicrucian manifestos explicitly mention connections to the Knights Templar. They describe their organization as the continuation of an ancient tradition, and their membership overlapped significantly with Freemasonry. The same individuals belonged to both organizations. The same symbols appeared in both traditions. They were different faces of the same underlying structure. In the 19th century, new organizations emerged that claimed Templar descent. The Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem was established in 1804, explicitly claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the medieval Templars. The Ordo Templi Orientis, founded in the early 20th century, incorporated Templar symbolism into its complex initiatory structure. These organizations ranged from legitimate historical societies to occult groups with questionable practices. But they all shared one characteristic. They claimed access to secret knowledge. They promised initiates that progressive degrees of membership would reveal hidden truths about history, religion, and the of reality. And they all traced their legitimacy back to the Knights Templar, back to what was discovered beneath Solomon's Temple, back to secrets that could not be revealed publicly but could be preserved through hidden traditions. The question is not whether these organizations are literally the Knights Templar. Clearly, they are not. 700 years have passed. Structures change. But the question is whether they preserve Templar knowledge, whether the secrets discovered in Jerusalem were successfully transmitted through these alternative channels. And the answer appears to be yes, because there are patterns. Patterns in how these organizations operate. Patterns in their symbolism. Patterns in their obsession with certain themes. Bloodlines. Sacred geometry. Hidden gospels. Alternative histories of Christianity. These are not random interests. These are the exact topics that would matter if the Templars had discovered evidence that Jesus was married, that his bloodline continued, that the Church had suppressed this truth for centuries. Modern historians are starting to acknowledge what conspiracy theorists have claimed for decades. The Templars did not simply disappear. They went underground. They created parallel structures. They infiltrated existing institutions. They ensured that their knowledge would survive even if their order did not. This is not speculation. This is documented in the archives of organizations that still exist today. The Grand Lodge of Scotland maintains records showing direct connections to knights who fled after 1307. The Portuguese National Archive contains documents proving that the Order of Christ was deliberately created to preserve Templar assets and knowledge. The Vatican's own records, the portions that have been released, show that Pope Clement V knew exactly what he was doing when he created these alternative structures. He was not destroying the Templars. He was giving them permission to survive under different names. And they did survive. Through centuries of transformation, persecution, and adaptation, the core mission continued. Preserve the knowledge, protect the secrets, wait for the moment when the world is ready to hear the truth. That moment may still not have arrived. 700 years later, the Vatican still classifies Templar documents at the highest security levels. Major Masonic lodges still refuse to publicly discuss what is taught in their highest degrees. Organizations claiming Templar descent still operate in secrecy, conducting rituals that outsiders are never permitted to witness. The knowledge is still protected. The secrets are still hidden. And the descendants of the Knights Templar, in whatever form they now take, are still waiting, still watching, still guarding truths that could rewrite everything humanity believes about its own history. 700 years have passed since Friday the 13th of October, 1307. Empires have risen and fallen. The medieval world has given way to modernity. We have split the atom, traveled to space, mapped the human genome. We have technologies that would seem like magic to the Templars. We have access to information that medieval scholars could never have imagined. And yet, the Vatican Secret Archives still maintain security protocols around Templar documents that exceed those for any other historical collection. Sections remain classified. Pages remain redacted. Entire volumes can only be accessed with direct papal permission, and even then, under supervision so strict that researchers describe it as hostile. Why? What could possibly justify this level of secrecy after 7 centuries? What truth could still be dangerous enough to require active suppression in the 21st century? The answer lies in understanding what the Templars actually discovered beneath Solomon's temple. Not treasure, though they found that too. Not ancient weapons or lost technology. What they found was documentation, genealogical records, letters, testimonies from witnesses who lived during the time of Jesus. Documents that told a story fundamentally different from the one the Church had been teaching for 1,000 years. These documents proved that Jesus was not divine in the way Christian theology claimed, that he was a Jewish rabbi who challenged Roman authority and was executed for it, that he had married, as was expected of Jewish men of his time, that his wife was Mary Magdalene, herself a woman of significant status and education, that they had children, that those children survived. that the bloodline continued through a family that fled to what is now southern France. And most dangerous of all, that the early church fathers knew all of this and deliberately suppressed it. This is not speculation. This is what the torture confessions describe. Once you strip away the veneer of heresy charges, when Templars spoke about denying Christ, they were actually describing their loss of faith in the Church's version of Christ. When they confessed to spitting on the cross, they were symbolically rejecting the instrument of execution that the Church had turned into its central symbol. When they spoke of worshipping a head called Baphomet, they were likely referring to relics or representations of figures whose true identity the Church could not acknowledge. The confessions, when read carefully, describe not devil worship, but a fundamental theological dispute. The Templars had evidence that Christianity, as practiced by the Church, was based on a deliberately falsified narrative. And that evidence was strong enough to convince warrior monks who had dedicated their lives to defending Christendom. But why would the Church falsify the story of Jesus? The answer is brutally simple: power. If Jesus was divine, if he was the literal Son of God, then the Church that claimed to represent him on earth had ultimate authority. Popes could claim to be the direct representatives of God's will. They could crown and depose kings. They could declare wars. They could accumulate wealth beyond measure. They could demand absolute obedience. But if Jesus was merely a remarkable man, a prophet, a teacher who was later mythologized by his followers, then the Church's authority collapsed. If Jesus had children, if there were living descendants who carried his bloodline, then those descendants had a better claim to spiritual authority than any pope. This is why the discovery was so dangerous. This is why the Templars had to be destroyed. Not because of what they did, but because of what they knew. The bloodline question is particularly troubling for the Church. Multiple Templar confessions reference families in the Languedoc region of southern France who were protected by the order. Families who claimed descent from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. These families were part of the Cathar religious movement, which the Church declared heretical in the 13th century. The Albigensian Crusade of 1209 was supposedly launched to suppress Cathar theology, but it resulted in the systematic extermination of the entire population of the Languedoc region. Entire cities were burned. Men, women, and children were massacred. When the papal legate was asked how to distinguish between Catholics and Cathars during the siege of Béziers, he reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." 20,000 people died in that city alone. Why such brutality? Why such thoroughness? Because the Church was not just suppressing a heretical movement. It was eliminating evidence. It was erasing bloodlines. It was making sure that no one could ever prove that Jesus had descendants. The Templars knew about these families because they had protected them. That was part of their true mission, not protecting pilgrims, not fighting Saracens, protecting the bloodline of Jesus, preserving the evidence of the true history of Christianity. And when the Church realized this, when Pope Clement V and King Philip IV understood what the Templars were really doing, they had no choice but to destroy the order completely. They could not allow this knowledge to survive. They could not risk having warrior monks who owed allegiance to a bloodline rather than to papal authority. So they manufactured charges of heresy. They tortured confessions. They burned the leaders at the stake. And they thought they had won. They thought they had destroyed the evidence and killed everyone who knew the truth. But they failed. Because the 18 ships that escaped from La Rochelle carried the most important documents: the genealogies, the letters, the testimonies, and they carried knights who had memorized the information, who could reproduce it even if all physical evidence was destroyed. These ships sailed to Portugal, to Scotland, and possibly to the Americas. They established new bases. They created alternative organizations. They ensured that the knowledge would survive. And for 700 years, that knowledge has been preserved in secret, passed down through initiatory traditions, protected by organizations that understand the consequences of revelation, kept alive but hidden, waiting for a time when humanity might be ready to hear it. The Vatican knows this. They know the documents survived. They know that organizations claiming Templar descent are not merely playing at medieval ritual. They are the actual custodians of actual knowledge. And this is why the Vatican maintains such extraordinary security around Templar archives. Because admitting the truth would require acknowledging that the foundational story of Christianity is false. It would require admitting that popes have claimed authority they never legitimately possessed. It would require rewriting 2,000 years of history. It would undermine the faith of billions of people. It would destroy the institution that has shaped Western civilization. The consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the Catholic Church, but for the entire concept of religious authority. Some researchers believe the full revelation is coming, that the 21st century, with its emphasis on historical evidence and scientific truth, cannot sustain this level of deception indefinitely. That eventually, someone will access the classified documents. That a pope will decide transparency is more important than institutional preservation. That the truth will finally emerge. But others argue that the revelation already happened, that the information is already available to anyone willing to look, that the evidence exists in scattered archives, in alternative gospels that were excluded from the Bible, in archaeological findings that mainstream scholarship refuses to acknowledge, that the only thing preventing people from seeing the truth is their unwillingness to confront it, their need to believe the comfortable lie rather than accept the uncomfortable reality. Because this is the final secret that the Templars died to protect. Not just that Jesus was married and had children. Not just that the Church lied about his divinity, but that truth itself is fragile. That institutions built on lies can survive for millennia if people want to believe them badly enough. That power structures, once established, will do absolutely anything to preserve themselves. That the most dangerous thing you can possess is not weapons or wealth, but knowledge that threatens the foundations of authority. The Templars learned this. They paid for it with torture and death. And 700 years later, the Vatican is still proving them right, still hiding documents, still maintaining security protocols, still treating truth as something too dangerous to reveal. The Templars are gone, but the secret remains, buried in archives, encoded in rituals, whispered in the highest degrees of organizations that outsiders can never fully understand, waiting, always waiting, for the moment when humanity is finally ready to know what really happened, or perhaps understanding that such a moment will never come, that some truths are simply too destructive to ever be spoken aloud. And maybe, just maybe, the Templars were right to keep it hidden.